A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, The Dream Warriors. It's a 1987 American fantasy slasher film directed by Chuck Russell. This story was developed by Wes Craven and Bruce Wagner and is the third installment in the Nightmare series. It's also the movie that brought back Heather Langenkamp as Nancy. Probably the best sequel in the Freddy films, this story follows Kristen, who is having terrible Freddy nightmares, who ends up in a mental home with a load of other teenagers who all have one thing in common: Freddy Krueger. This movie has it all, and the kills are definitely a lot more brutal than the first two movies. So get yourselves comfy and let's take a look at 10 moments from A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, The Dream Warriors. Number 10. The opening nightmare. It all begins with character Kristen, who falls asleep, only to wake up in the dream world right outside Freddy's house. Kristen sees a load of children singing the Freddy nursery rhyme while skipping, until she meets a little girl at the doorway riding a bicycle. When the little girl goes into the house, Kristen runs in after her, and Kristen finds the little girl in the basement, where the little girl tells Kristen that this is where he takes us. All of a sudden, the boiler turns itself on, and we hear some footsteps coming from upstairs, and the little girl says, "Freddy's home." Kristen then picks up the little girl and runs through the house, where Freddy isn't far behind. Kristen ends up getting stuck in some brown slimy sludge, but manages to get out just before Freddy catches her. She then ends up in another room of Freddy's house, where she is greeted by hundreds of dead hanging teenagers. The little girl, who is still in Kristen's arms, says, "Put me down, you're hurting me." And Kristen then looks at the little girl in her arms, and this little girl has turned into a rotting corpse. And Kristen screams out loud before waking up from this horrific nightmare. It's a brilliant opening nightmare sequence that really creeps you out and makes you jump. In fact, I think it's the best opening nightmare scene in all the Freddy movies. Number 9. Bathroom Horror. Straight after Kristen's nightmare, she heads into the bathroom to freshen herself up, and as she goes to turn on the taps literally grab Kristen's hands, and the door behind her slams shut. Freddy then appears in the mirror and starts laughing. The taps that have got hold of Kristen's hand, they start coming out of the sink, while the other one starts producing the knives of Freddy's glove. Freddy then uses the taps to cut Kristen's wrists, and then her mum walks in. Freddy has disappeared, but the slashes on Kristen's wrists are still there. So Kristen's mum ends up sending her to a mental home. Number 8. Freddy's Snake. A classic moment now in our next spot, and Kristen is about to have a nightmare that she's never going to forget. While Kristen is sketching Freddy's house, she dozes off before being woken up by the door opening, followed by the small bike that the little girl was riding at the start of the movie. Kristen gets out of bed, and then the bike starts to melt in front of her, and before you know it, Kristen is back in Freddy's house. She walks into the dining room, where a pig on the table comes alive and scares her. She then ends up in an empty lounge area, where all of a sudden, something under the carpet starts slithering around the room and up the wall, causing absolute carnage. Whatever is under that carpet ends up disappearing for a few moments, but then all of a sudden a huge Freddy snake pops up from the ground and starts eating Kristen. Kristen screams out for Nancy and ends up pulling Nancy into the nightmare, and when Nancy arrives, she sees Kristen pretty much in the mouth of this huge Freddy snake, and Nancy ends up stabbing him with a piece of broken mirror. Kristen then manages to get free, and then the Freddy snake just comes face to face with Nancy, and no word of a lie, this huge face on this snake is terrifying. Nancy and Kristen then make a run for it, and they manage to get themselves out of the nightmare just before the Freddy snake smashes through the door. A funny fact about this scene, originally the Freddy snake was going to be pink, but unfortunately when they were going to film this scene, the Freddy snake ended up looking like a giant dick. So they gave the Freddy snake a dark green gunge makeover. Number 7, Sleepwalking with a Twist. A pretty gruesome scene now in our next spot. And character Philip is fast asleep and one of his puppets ends up coming alive and walks over to his bed, where this puppet Freddy turns into a fully grown Freddy. And Philip goes to scream, but Freddy tells him to shh. Freddy then slices Philip's veins in his arms and his legs, and he pulls the veins out like a piece of string and turns Philip into a bloody human puppet and walks him out of his room. Kincaid wakes up and he just thinks that Philip is sleepwalking and leaves him to it. Freddy then takes Philip through the hospital and up onto the roof where Joey spots him. Joey tries to get help from everyone and they all try to call out to Philip from the window to try and wake him up. Unfortunately, Freddy cuts Philip's veins before they get a chance to wake him up, and Philip goes flying off the top of the building and to his death. Another brilliant classic scene. Number 6, Welcome to Primetime, Bitch. This movie just gets better and better, and this next scene is just brilliant. Character Jennifer doesn't want to go to sleep, not after what happened to Philip the previous night. So staff member Max allows Jennifer to stay in the lounge room to watch TV. While she's watching TV, she uses a cigarette butt and burns herself to keep herself awake, but it's too late. The chat show that Jennifer is watching on TV turns real and brutal when Freddy ends up popping up and attacking the female guest. The TV then loses signal and turns to static, and Jennifer decides to walk down towards this TV to fix it. She plays around with the buttons and she then tries banging the TV, and then all of a sudden these big massive metal Freddy arms pop out from either side of the TV and grabs Jennifer. Then Freddy's head melts out of the top of the TV. Freddy tells Jennifer that this is her big break in TV and says welcome to primetime, bitch, before throwing Jennifer head first into the TV, killing her instantly. I absolutely love this scene, but it did get me thinking. Imagine if this particular Freddy movie was remade in 2022. The televisions these days are massive, so it would be interesting to see how they would recreate this particular scene if it ever did happen. Number 5, Feeling tongue-tied. After Nancy and Neil think that they've just failed at some group hypnosis, Joey goes off to grab himself some water from the water fountain, where he sees his nurse crush walking up the corridor and she's nodding at him to follow her. So of course, Joey follows. He ends up in a private room with her, and this nurse starts telling Joey that she really likes him and that she comes into work every day just to see him. Before you know it, the nurse starts to seduce Joey. She takes off all her clothes and she ends up on top of him on the bed, where they embrace in a deep, wet kiss. Like literally, this nurse is pretty much eating Joey's mouth. But then, all of a sudden, the nurse starts to pull out Joey's tongue, and I mean, this is a big long tongue. The nurse then fires a load of tongues to Joey's arms and legs, which ties him to the bed. The nurse then turns into Freddy, and Freddy asks Joey, "What's wrong, Joey? Feeling tongue-tied?" And Joey is then lowered to a burning fire, where he remains as a hostage. Number 4, Let's Get High. The last of the Elm Street children decide enough is enough, and Kristen, Nancy, Taryn, Will and Kincaid head into the dream world to save Joey and to destroy Freddy once and for all. Unfortunately, the group ends up being split up, and Taryn ends up on a dodgy looking street in the dream world, where we end up seeing a homeless man and some graffiti on the wall with her and Freddy's name on. Before you know it, Freddy arrives, welcoming Taryn back to the streets. Taryn then offers Freddy out and they start fighting. At one point, Taryn seems to get the upper hand, but then Freddy pulls out some injections on his fingers, and the holes on Taryn's arms start doing this weird sucking, chewing noise as they open and close. It's really gross. Freddy then plunges the injections into Taryn's arm, where she lets out a huge scream, and you see all of her veins starting to bulge out through his skin, where she eventually dies. Another fun fact, originally the director wanted Taryn's head to explode in her final moments, but they were on a bit of a tight time scale and they ended up changing their mind at the last minute. But how good would it have been if Taryn's head did end up exploding? Number 3, I am the Wizard Master. Straight after Taryn's death, we cut to Will, who is alone down an eerie long corridor. He turns and sees a huge wheelchair at one end of the corridor, which, by the way, how scary does this wheelchair look? Who would have thought that a simple object could look so scary? At the other end of the corridor is Freddy, telling Will that it's back to the saddle, and then this giant wheelchair comes flying down the corridor towards Will, but he manages to jump to the side as it passes him, and ends up falling to the floor. The wheelchair then turns around and heads down to finish Will off. But Will then uses his dream power to become the Wizard Master, where Will ends up jumping up and firing some powers at the wheelchair, which causes it to explode. Will then fires the same power at Freddy, and Will runs down towards him thinking that Freddy is dying, but Freddy ends up grabbing Will, lifts him up, and tells him that he doesn't believe in fairy tales, and ends up stabbing Will to death with his Freddy claw. Every time I see this scene, I always feel like I'm watching a horror version of Harry Potter, and it always makes me giggle. Number 2, Skeleton Freddy. Dr. Neil Gordon and Nancy's dad are at a very old and rundown scrapyard, where they are about to bury Freddy Krueger's remains that were originally hidden in a trunk of a car. When they start moving the bones and digging a hole, Freddy can feel his bones being moved in the real world, so Freddy becomes the skeleton, and the skeleton comes alive and attacks Nancy's dad and Neil. The skeleton ends up throwing Nancy's dad up against a piece of metal where he is impaled and killed. The skeleton then attacks Neil with a spade and knocks him into the hole that he has just dug. The skeleton then starts to fill up the hole and starts to bury Neil alive. It's quite creepy watching a dead skeleton burying a human alive, and I know the effects in this scene aren't the best by today's standards, but you have to admit that is one very creepy skeleton that they use, and the loud roaring noise that the skeleton makes just as Freddy leaves is very unnerving. Before we get to number 1, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We currently upload new videos every week and we are really looking to grow this channel, so make sure to hit that notification bell as well. Number 1, Nancy and Freddy's death. Now, I've always found the ending of this movie the most shocking out of any Elm Street movie, because this is the moment where Nancy Thompson is killed. So, her dad, who has just been attacked by the skeleton, appears in the dream, coming to say goodbye to Nancy because he has crossed over. When Nancy gives her dad one final hug, her dad turns into Freddy, and Freddy plunges his claw straight into Nancy. Neil then wakes up in the muddy hole and he starts to climb out and shoves the bones into the burial site. Kristen then tries to help Nancy by fighting Freddy, but Freddy gets the upper hand, but then Nancy jumps up and uses Freddy's own glove to stab him and holds on to him for dear life. Neil then gets some holy water and flicks it onto the bones, causing Freddy in the dream world to let out a massive roar, and finally Neil uses the cross to lay Freddy to rest, and Freddy ends up bursting into a bright light before disappearing from the dream world for good, at least for now. Kincaid and Joey burst into the room and they find Kristen cradling a dead Nancy in her arms. It's a real tragic scene and it really does shock me that they killed off Nancy. I'm not sure whether if it was Heather's choice for Nancy to be killed off or if it was the writers, but either way it's a memorable scene in the Elm Street movies. And that was 10 moments from A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, The Dream Warriors. So guys, do we have any fans of this movie? Do you think this is the best sequel in the Elm Street world? I have honestly watched this movie about 50 times, probably more, and I never get bored of it. I think it's a classic Freddy movie, and it's definitely my favourite sequel in the collection, but let me know all of your thoughts in the comments box below. Okay guys, well thank you all for watching, make sure you smash that subscribe button, stay safe and I'll see you all again very soon.